I've been asked to speak about Damascus at the beginning of the revolution. And to clarify my own background, I came to Syria in fall 2010 to work on my Arabic and to conduct research. And I ended up staying there until April 2011. I spent very little time with other foreigners during my stay in Damascus, and I was lucky enough to find fairly quickly a group of Syrian friends with shared interests that I grew very close to. And these friends that I made in Syria wound up becoming key organizers in some of the local coordinating committees in Yabrud, Douma, and elsewhere throughout Syria. So today I want to dispel a few misconceptions I've noticed when I talk to people about the revolution, particularly regarding Damascus. And while I debated the best format for addressing these issues, I've decided to deviate a bit from a typical conference format and talk more about my own personal observations while living in Syria during some of the formative months of the uprising. So the narrative around Damascus usually goes that until fairly recently, Damascenes remained quiet throughout everything that was going on in Syria, either because the regime was able to squash protests there by just brute force, or also because the wealthier, more educated citizens of the capital didn't want a revolution in the first place. And it's easy to see why one would assume that to be the case, but it's based on a misreading of the spatial dynamics of Syrian protests caused by taking a macro rather than a micro view. So first of all, many of the people, as Layla elaborated a bit, many of the people living in Damascus are first or second generation Damascenes, and they identify quite strongly with the towns where their parents or grandparents grew up in, or where they may have partially grown up. And many residents in Damascus, when they chose to protest, would choose to go back to these towns that they identified with, rather than risking the mukhabarat surveillance and the snipers, which were put in place in many key areas of Damascus in the very first months of protests in Syria. Additionally, many of the protests and organizing that took place in rural Damascus included Damascene residents from the inner city who did this for the same reasons. For instance, one of my friends lived in Muhajirin, which is pretty much in the center of Damascus, and she regularly visited Douma in rural Damascus, where she participated in workshops and discussion groups with women there, and that was very common. This is also connected to this idea that minority groups have not participated in the uprising because protests have been seen as occurring mostly in Sunni areas and coming out of mosques. And the Syrian Christians and Alawis I knew actually attended services at mosques on Friday in places where they knew protests would begin, because these were the only safe places to gather people together in large groups. The Damascene equivalent of Tahrir Square was almost all the possible squares almost always had a security branch located directly inside of the square. So again, someone who was a bystander observing protests might see all the people coming out of a mosque and assume that everyone who was protesting was Sunni Muslim, but that was not actually the case. What I also think is missing, even from people who have been following events in Syria somewhat, is an understanding of the dynamics and discussion taking place in Damascus right beneath the surface, and how much the revolution was a surprise even to those people who ended up being key organizers and key figures in the revolution. And by that, I don't mean that it was a surprise to them that a revolution occurred, but it would have been a surprise to them had you told them 3 years ago that a revolution occurred and that they themselves became key figures in the revolution, or even became protesters. And I think that kind of understanding gets overlooked a lot of times, because even though you can talk to Syrians now about what the revolution means to them personally, it's very different to know people in Syria before 2011 and see the ways in which the revolution transformed them personally. So in my first months in Damascus, the friends I made were mostly architects and archaeologists. They were for the most part middle class and from outside of Damascus, so first generation Damascenes basically. And they were very involved in community projects, in particular regarding increasing public access to the architectural heritage of the old city, which had started to become available only to foreigners with enough money to buy private homes, or expatriate Syrians. But they were all very explicitly apolitical, and they would always mention this anytime discussions seemed to be veering towards whatever they deemed to be too political. And even though I knew that Syria before coming wasn't an open environment for discussing politics, I was still surprised many times by what fell under the category of too political, and I learned to steer away from even very, very mundane topics, which might be misconstrued as political by an eavesdropper. In December 2010, I had to leave the country to renew my visa, and I went to Lebanon, which, so for renewing a visa for American takes a month. And in the time I was there, Ben Ali fled Tunisia, and protests began in Egypt. So I came back to Syria in mid-January, and I went to surprise my friends who were sitting in a cafe in Naufara, which is right in the middle of Syria. It's always packed with people. There's always people walking by. And after a few minutes, I realized that something was very strange. All my friends, these friends who were always apolitical and always, chastising me if I ever said anything that, might be construed as too political, were cracking jokes about Egypt, cracking jokes about Mubarak, and there were strangers sitting all around us. And I just stayed silent. And it really took me a while to figure out what was going on. For the next week, I kept having similar things happen, witnessing similar things happening. And I didn't really realize until later that what I was seeing in mid-January in Syria were the first cracks in the wall of fear that people talk about. But those really didn't become visible to outsiders until a few months later. A few months after this incident, Assad delivered his first speech since the beginning of protests in the country. And I was at a friend's house, and we ran downstairs to watch with his roommates on the TV in their living room, all of us sharing the TV. At this point in time, dozens of protesters had been killed by security forces with no comment by Assad. And many, if not most, of the Syrians that I knew still believe that Bashar himself was good, but that the inner circle around him were corrupt, possibly, and those were the ones that were controlling things. And there was really a palpable excitement among all of them that this speech would be the speech where he would apologize for these killings and introduce reforms. So the speech was very long, it was very circumvented, and it wasn't really clear where it was going, but there was a sense, this excitement from the room drained with every mention of a conspiracy, with every mention of enemies. And finally, he kind of finished the speech and just walked off the stage. And the entire room was silent. These 10 guys sitting in this room that had been so excited. And then one of the roommates just said, "That's it." And no one had to say anything else. It was so clear what everyone was thinking. And many of these people later became key organizers in different coordinating committees in Damascus. So these are little moments that, without even maybe feeling it until later, connecting the dots until later, came to politicize thousands of Syrians who would have previously declared that they're not political people. And it's strange now when I bring up with some friends the thing that they said to me before or during the first few months of 2011, which are so different from what they think now that they take a while to recognize themselves as having said or believed them. And it's also striking to realize how totally Syria and Syrians have changed when you go back to the beginning to see the events or the declarations that were considered shockingly bold at the time, but now seem tame or even still seem very, very pro-regime. And if you ask any Syrian who's been in protests what their first protest was like, you get for me, it's been an almost universal answer. They say there was this moment of total freedom and this feeling of complete exhilaration where this fear leading up to their first protest was replaced by something like a rush or a high, and they would seek it out again and again, always waiting till they could go to the next protest. And I've talked to many people about that, and they've said that when they talk to their other Syrian friends, it's the same answer, always. And most people actually, when I've asked that question, have told me that was the single greatest moment of their lives, the majority. This is a point, I think, this idea which has been missed in many journalistic and academic accounts, the way in which in the course of just a few months, 2 months or 3 months, the revolution caused people to undergo radical personal transformations shaped by these small, emotionally charged moments. So on that same note, today is an especially fitting day for this event, as it is the birthday of Father Paolo, who is an Italian Jesuit priest who lived in Syria for many decades and became a leading figure in the revolution. And despite the rumors, I won't say Allah yarhamu, may God rest his soul, but Allah yahmi, may God protect him, because I want so badly to believe that we will hear from him again soon. I want to share a story about a very special event in the revolution involving Paolo that I was lucky to have been witness to. On Orthodox Easter weekend, some friends and I took the drive from Damascus to the monastery of St. Moses, Deir Mar Musa, carved into the mountainside in the middle of the desert. the picture. The church dates back to the 6th century, and its original frescoes are still preserved. It had been abandoned, but it was renovated by Paolo as a center for Christian and Islamic studies and Muslim-Christian dialogue. And in addition to his Jesuit training, Paolo extensively studied Islamic theology, and he speaks fluent Arabic. The picture of Paolo? Yeah. Derma Musa attracts small groups of travelers from all religions across Syria and across the world who come and stay and eat for free in exchange for helping with cooking, cleaning, and donations. For Arab Christians, Easter is a much more meaningful and elaborate holiday often than Christmas, and we spent Friday doing Stations of the Cross, wandering into the mountains with a wood carving of Christ, and going through the condemning of death up until Christ was placed in the tomb, while different people took turns reading from the Bible. And on Holy Saturday, we spent a quiet day resting, just as Christ rested in the tomb. And finally, at night, the figurine of Christ was wrapped in a white shroud in the middle of the church, and people came up to kiss his head and lay flowers that they had collected in the mountains. Then Paolo began a sermon. He wished safety for the president, as the church was required to do by the anonymous government minders who would pop in periodically to check on him. And I saw a friend wince out of the corner of my eye, because at that point in time, 200 people had been killed in protests, and the traditional Easter processions in Syria had been canceled to respect those who had died. And Paolo then began to preach of the sacrifice that Christ had made for forgiveness and for peace, and he started to speak of the slain brothers and sisters in Daraa and other parts of Syria who had given their lives for a greater cause. And this was the first time I had ever heard someone in Syria talk in this way about the people who had died in such a public forum. And most of the people in attendance were weeping. And this statement just seems so measured and so almost self-censored now. But at the time, for an important figure to speak that way in Syria felt very, very powerful. And he was even more so because this took place in the establishment, one of the key establishments of a religious group which the media and outsiders claimed would never criticize the regime. And in fact, 1 year and 1 month later, Paolo's last act before leaving Syria was presiding over the funeral of my friend, the Syrian filmmaker Basil Shahade, who was killed in Homs, who also happened to be a Christian. After this service, we went to sleep, and at midnight we were woken up and came into the church. And the dark mood from the burial on Saturday still hung over the room. But during the service, the mood began to change to one of joy, and the liturgical music became dance music, and everyone started to dance and sing and kiss each other's cheeks. And those who hadn't been able to wake up in the middle of the night kept coming into the church, and we were dancing together until it became dawn. And this celebration held such a sense of optimism for the coming months in Syria, and a sense that those martyrs that Paolo spoke of in his speech would be soon honored by what was to come of their sacrifice. I had to leave Syria 3 days after, and soon afterwards, Paolo released a public letter demanding a peaceful transition to democracy in Syria. He met with opposition activists and issued public statements condemning the deaths and imprisonments of Syrian dissidents. He was answered with an expulsion order from the regime. And despite this, he stayed in Syria in hiding until May 2012, when at the urge of his bishop, he left to Iraqi Kurdistan. In July 2013, Paolo entered rebel-held territory in eastern Syria to work on mediating between different rebel groups and LCCs. Soon afterwards, he was kidnapped in Raqqa by members of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, an al-Qaeda affiliate, and his current whereabouts and status are unknown. This, unfortunately, is all too representative of the current situation in which many Syrians feel they are fighting for two revolutions, one against the regime and one against al-Qaeda affiliates who are just as opposed to their interests and in many areas have become a more tangible threat than the government. I know that some of the other talks today will do a more thorough job than I have in dismantling certain distorted narratives around Syria. I haven't presented a theory here or empirical evidence, but a series of anecdotes from some of Syria's most formative months. And in all discourse around Syria, I think there exists a strong tension between the empirical and the anecdotal. This is a tension I have felt deeply in my own experiences, which often seem to me to stand in stark contrast to traditional narratives about the revolution. And I often feel that Syria experts who may have a deep understanding of the country before the revolution don't quite grasp how different Syrians have become since they did their field work. Imagine my surprise when I was in Damascus reading interviews with Syrian scholars in the US and Europe, reiterating again and again in interviews that minorities were scared of joining the revolution as I watched my Christian and Alawi friends head out to Friday protests at the mosque. I don't mean to dismiss structural or more comprehensive analyses, which I think are quite valuable, but I do hope to draw attention to the ways in which, especially in times of rapid and radical societal change, we should remain aware that things often look completely different from inside, and we aren't always well attuned to the logic of dynamics, which may look very different on the surface. Thank you very much.